no further ado, I give you Mr. Rowan Iswanta to chair the session.
Thank you, Prince. Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So for this session, I will chair this session, and because we already run behind the schedule for 20 minutes, and from the committee, I got information that we have to finish at 12. So so we have like 90 minutes, no, less than 90 minutes, I think. So each presenter will have like maximum 50 minutes to speak, and then we will have a question and answer. So for this session, we have 4 speakers here, and the first speaker is Chris Russell. He is the government expert in private sector and in private sector development initiative. And the second speaker will be David Paul, the senator from Republic of the Marshall Islands. And the third speaker will be Mr. Sione Akaola. He's from Tonga. And then the last speaker will be Mr. Kiatu Tabue Bueti, and he's from Kiribati. Because of time, I will not introduce one by one. So please, Chris, your time, 15 minutes. 15, sorry. So then we will have more time for question and answer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. 15 minutes. Well, let's see what we can do. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the session. I'm going to very quickly run you through the data that we have collected for the most recent finding balance study. This is the 5th finding balance study that the ADB has been involved in. It's the regional SOE benchmarking study. First one was in 2009. And over the years, we've collected an increasing amount of data. So the study now covers data from 2002 through to 2014. And each year that we've done it, we have increased the number of countries involved. So in the study that is yet to be published, we anticipate the study will be published in August. There are going to be 10 countries in it that we have undertaken an in-depth survey for. 8 of those are in the Pacific and 2 are non-Pacific Island countries. So we tried to do a comparison between Pacific Island countries and non-Pacific Island countries. And we've also included New Zealand and Singapore to look at these 2 countries because they tended to be viewed as benchmarks for effective SOE management. That's very loud. So very quickly, those are the countries that are involved in the survey. The countries cover obviously a large range from large to small. PNG is the largest of the Pacific Island countries, but has the lowest per capita income. Despite the differences in the sizes of the countries involved, a finding for us is that the principles associated with state-owned enterprise reform are universal. Small countries, large countries, Pacific and non-Pacific. We think that lessons that can be learned are totally transferable. The study would not be possible without the excellent cooperation of the ministries that are involved, and I'd like to acknowledge that now. One of the reasons why we choose the countries we do is that they have benchmark portfolios that are comparable, and this slide just quickly runs through the makeup of the portfolio. The portfolios are composed of majority-owned and controlled corporatized entities that are for commercial purposes. So, for example, we don't include provident funds and insurance companies because we believe they're owned by the participants. But in a country like Fiji, we do include the Fiji Electricity Authority because although it's a government-controlled state entity, it is operated on a commercial basis. So all portfolios include between 8 to 24 SOEs, and in 9 of the 12 countries, the infrastructure SOEs dominate the portfolio, representing 68% to 100% of total assets in 2014. The financial performance of the SOE portfolio is generally quite weak. You'll note that only 2 of the SOE portfolios in the benchmarking study produce sufficient returns to cover their capital costs, and the other 2 on the left-hand side, Solomon Islands and Mauritius. Only 6 of the portfolios have average returns on equity and assets above 0 for the period between 2010 and 2014. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'm focusing on that period, the more recent period, rather than the historic period. And these low returns are achieved even though the SOEs benefit from substantial subsidised debt. Of the countries involved, the average debt for SOEs was 5%, whereas the commercial rate was 12%. The SOEs are large. They control between 7 and 21% of total fixed assets of each country, yet contribute only between 0.3% to 12% of GDP in 2012. In developed countries, these statistics are a little bit different. In Singapore and New Zealand, the SOEs control around 5% to 9% of total fixed capital and contribute between 1 to 4% of GDP. Generally, the SOEs create quite a significant fiscal strain on government resources. In addition to the initial investment that's gone into these SOEs, governments also provide ongoing transfers in the form of debt forgiveness, asset donations, cash infusions, and of course also subsidised debt and equity. 6 of the 10 countries in our sample require ongoing government support to maintain their SOE portfolios. And only 5 of the countries did SOE net profits exceed the value of government transfers in 2010 through to 2014. And that is in Fiji, Tonga, Solomon Islands, Kiribati and Mauritius. And of course this ongoing government support crowds out the private sector, which a number of these SOEs compete with. Governments have to make significant choices when they decide to continue to support their SOEs. In this side, we look at the cumulative government transfers against the health budgets in the countries in the survey. Ongoing investment in underperforming SOEs has both direct and indirect costs. By investing scarce resources in inefficient and loss-making public enterprises, they drain funds away from social sectors. During 2010 and 2014, the value of government transfers to SOEs ranged from 9 to 36% of government expenditure on health services. So if that money hadn't gone into the SOEs, there would have been a significant amount of additional money that could have gone into important health services. In only Tonga, Kiribati, Fiji and the Sols do they have a negative return. In other words, what's happening there is the SOEs are actually generating more back to the economy than they're actually taking in those countries. The 2 slides I'm going to go through now is just a pictorial view of the return on assets for the countries involved in the survey. And this one is the large countries. And you'll see that it's quite a roller coaster ride. If you're on that ride, you'd probably have an upset stomach. And it's really not much different for the small economies. And I think the observation you make there is there's probably very little strategy behind the management of those SOEs portfolios. One I would draw your attention to, though, is the Solomon Islands. You'll see the Solomon Islands colour, which is the orange one there, very low in 2008, climbing up to over 10% in 2012. That is what happens when you undertake a broad-based SOE reform program. You can achieve significant gains in a very short period of time. One of the key areas of focus for the study, and how much time do I have left? Anyone timing me? If you're not timing me, I'll take as much time as I need. 5 minutes? Thank you very much. One of the points that we want to make is that the SOE model really is not a sustainable model. It has fundamental flaws. It is not fair to ask politicians to make commercial decisions. That's not what they're there for. They're there to undertake political decisions, and it's not a comment on the competency of politicians. Politicians are very, very competent people, but asking them to make decisions that are fundamentally commercial decisions that should be made by boards puts a politician in a very, very difficult situation. All things being equal, you can manage commercial risks over time, but it's very, very difficult to manage the political risk. What the SOE model tries to do is to manage that conflict between the political oversight and the commercial stewardship within the legislative framework or the policy framework under which the SOEs operate. You can achieve a balance, and in fact, there's some excellent SOE acts and SOE frameworks around the Pacific where that balance is enshrined in legislation. The point that we're making, though, that it is almost impossible to sustain that balance over the medium to long term. There is not a country that we have identified in the study, not just in the Pacific, but in the world, where they've been able to maintain good commercial returns over SOE portfolios over the medium to long term. So New Zealand is quite telling. That's the SOE portfolio in New Zealand, and you'll see that the returns have steadily declined over the years. This only looks at from 2000, but if you go back even further, the returns were over 13 to 16% for that portfolio, so it is a steady decline downwards. And why? I mean, fundamentally, it's poor governance. The longer the SOEs remain in political ownership, the politicians see them more and more as political liabilities and less as commercial assets. And if you're not monitoring these SOEs effectively, boards over time believe that they own them, and then they start to manage these SOEs as if what makes the board comfortable, and quite often what you find is they get involved in non-commercially justifiable investments. And there's a classic case of this, if you want to do a case study, Solid Energy New Zealand, where an SOE went from total assets of over $1 billion to defaulting on its bank loans in the period of 18 months. Singapore is often cited as being the Havana of SOE management, and in fact, if you look at the slide there with Singapore, you'd have to say that the performance looks reasonably okay, but one of the things you might look at is you'll see that the return on equity is twice that of the return on assets, which would indicate the portfolio is quite heavily geared. And in fact, when you dig into that gearing, as this slide does, you'll find that 3 of Singapore's SOEs, 3 out of the 9, have debt-to-equity ratios in excess of 100%. And what Singapore can do, which I don't see in many other countries, is that they actually have situations where they have accounts payable to equity of the range of about 116%. So in other words, your accounts payable is more than the SOE's equity. So effectively what they're doing in Singapore is leveraging others to support their portfolio. And although there's no explicit guarantee for SOEs, studies have indicated that there is an implicit government guarantee. So on the face of it, the Singaporean SOEs look reasonable, but when you dig in, they're not even performing as well as the Solomon Islands. The return on assets in Singapore is below the return on assets in Solomon Islands. People talk about Temasek as being an effective holding company structure. It's basically now a sovereign wealth fund. Only 27% of its assets are SOEs. It might be a model that can work in Singapore, but it's questionable whether or not it would work outside of Singapore. So what is our message? Our message is the SOE model is a really, really important model for improving service delivery from activities that were originally in core government services, when they're set up in a corporatised model with good accountability, transparency, strong governance arrangements, under a strong legislative framework. When you do that, you are going to achieve efficiency gains. And in fact, studies around the world indicate that 80% of efficiency gains you achieve through commercialisation and corporatisation are achieved in that process. So I'm not standing here and saying the SOE model is not a good model. It is a good model as a transition, but it was never designed as a long-term ownership model, and after a period of time you will see returns deteriorate. So the only way to offset that is to lock in private sector investment. So we advocate that it's important to get the private sector in, either through full privatisation, partial privatisation, and in some cases you can't do that for obvious reasons. You've got a monopoly with weak regulatory environment, then even just partial privatisation, contracting out, and PPPs. Anything that will encourage the SOE to internalise commercial disciplines is to be applauded. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. 50 minutes. So thank you very much for your comprehensive explanation about the benchmarking performance in islands economies. So now let's listen from the country experience. For the first speakers will be from Republic of Marshall Island. Please.
Good morning, everyone, and I bring greetings from the Marshall Islands. My presentation is not going to be that long, and if you were paying attention to the presentation that was done by Mr. Russell, I mean, my presentation actually complements it, because if you were looking at one of the slides that showed that in the SOE in the RMI, the return on asset and return on equity was all negative. And this presentation, it will show that, you know, although it's all negative news as far as SOE performance in the Marshall Islands, there's always a silver lining in there, where the experience that we went through as the utilities in the Marshalls went through a major reform starting in 2009 up until now. So it's Marshall's Energy Company recovery and reform effort since 2008. Okay, the outline is pretty self-explanatory. We're going to go through the overview of MEC, Marshall's Energy Company, the MEC situation before 2008, and that's a very significant date because that's when the energy crisis hit. And then after that is the energy crisis itself, the comprehensive recovery plan, and the challenges that were met and the ongoing challenges, and then the action to sustain progress, and then of course the conclusion. But so the company overview is the main corporate principle is to provide an affordable and reliable energy services to the people of the Marshall Islands, and the company motto is efficiency today, profitability tomorrow. MEC was incorporated in 1985 under the laws of the RMI, and it is governed by a 7-member board of directors. MEC provides electricity through diesel power generation as well as solar to the whole RMI. And MEC has a very diversified business portfolio, and we're also in the fuel and gas business as well. Before 2008, the financial and the operation conditions of Marshall's Energy Company was already in very critical position, which led up to the 2008 crisis. Just to give you a few examples, the generators, the diesel generators were in poor condition. They were very inefficient. Major losses and inefficiencies throughout the entire system, and which accounts for over 30% of system losses. There was a steady decline in asset. There was no reinvestment in our assets, and the only way for us to be able to get out of it was actually recapitalization of the entire company. The average losses on an annual basis between 2003 to 2007 was around $2.4 million, which actually accumulated up to around $18 million in net deficiency position of the overall financial position of the company. By 2007, and as I said, $18 million in total debt. Most of it was actually from high interest. We reached at around $2 million in annual debt servicing, around $5 million in accounts receivable built up, and one of the core business component of the company was actually fuel sales was no longer providing a cushion. The bottom line is Marshall's Energy Company was basically insolvent. And then the crisis hit. Fuel prices increasing since 2004, spiked up in 2008. That's when the price of fuel actually reached around almost $200 a barrel at the time. It was a tipping point for Marshall's Energy Company, and we were actually projecting continuous operating loss by the end of 2008. And austerity measures were taken by both the company as well as the country, and energy support requests for the government was sought at the time, and not from the government, but also from the development partners. We had high fuel and food prices hit the economy very hard. There's a high commodity prices. Fiscal system was already stressed, and we were actually facing a structural deficit, not just for the company, but for the entire country. And that's when the first state of economic emergency was actually declared back in 2008. And there are some of the clips that was all over the media, our only newspaper, and all over the region, the RMI declared a state of economic emergency. Further, it actually forced the entire country to adopt short, medium, and long-term measures to adjust and adapt to the present condition at the time. The food and energy pricing were the target, and there was a national task force that was formed to manage the response from the entire, not just the government, but all across sectors. And the social impact, economic impact was very clear. By the end of 2008, consumer price index had jumped nearly 15%, and 1,500 people, actually 3% of the population, migrated to the United States, and is actually an ongoing trend today. Now, for the Comprehensive Recovery Plan, in late 2009, new board of directors and management took over MEC, and the Comprehensive Recovery Plan was implemented in 2010. And two main pillars of the CRP was actually cost and culture. Culture means the corporate culture. Cost reduction measures were adopted. Operational cost reduction, increased fuel efficiency for the generators was very critical, because actually fuel was account for about 75% of the operating costs at the time. Restructuring of long-term debt. Bank of Guam, there was a debt with Bank of Guam with 7% interest to 5 years amortization of fixed rate. And when we refinanced it and liquidate that debt and then took out a loan with ADB, and the debt with ADB is 1.5% interest of 30 years amortization. So that saves us over $1 million in interest cost. The other one is our U.S. debt service deferment of a 2-year, which allows us to free up more cash flow, so we can take all of that free cash flow to free up cash flow so we can reinvest in the critical infrastructure, especially the generators, to make them more energy efficient. The operational reform, a refurbishment of basically the challenges that we met and not met, and one of them is the operational reform, refurbishment of generators, completed, and we were able to reduce the fuel consumption on the generators. We brought down from 14,000 gallons in 24 hours to 10,000 gallons in 24 hours. The institutional reform that was part of the Comprehensive Recovery Plan was the implementation of new procurement policy, which saves us over close to about $100,000 a year in making more competitive, streamline all the procurement process, build a central warehouse so we can consolidate all of our procurement and all of our supplies and equipments and all. The implementation of new employee manual and the implementation of board governance manual. All these were, I consider, institutional reform to streamline the operation of the organization. Rolling out of the new business strategy, negotiate a new fuel supply agreement. We went away from spot sale to a consignment arrangement with our new suppliers, so we no longer have to come up with working capital to secure up to $10 million worth of fuel, but all the cost of inventory actually shifted over to the supplier. So there is no cost on our balance sheet or on our P&L. Everything is actually on the supplier. So high grading of all accounts for LPG sales, convert fuel sales from a margin to a volume business because there's no cost of inventory. So we were selling a lot of fuel, and instead of highballing the margin, but we were trying to push volume, so we were taking less margin, but also we're pushing a lot of volumes to translate into a lot of sales, which increased the profitability of the company. And the introduction of the cash power meters was actually put a lid on accounts receivables and then increase the cash flow position of the company at the time. The challenges that were not met, there's ongoing challenges. Today is the 30% system loss, continuous. System reliability, because we have a very old infrastructure, and then our fuel terminal needs an upgrade because, as I said, we are very diversified, and fuel sales is one of our business, core business. Actions to sustain progress, secure financing for the refurbishment of a fuel terminal, where that is one of the continuous goal for the company. Finalizing the terms of reference with ADB on formulation of the strategic and investment plan for the next 10 years for MEC. This is very important because we want to make sure that we can allocate our resources better and do what we call an incremental investment to upgrade our overall infrastructure to provide a reliable and sustainable service for the entire Marshall Islands for its energy services. And the other one is to secure and funding and financing for the reduction of system losses. This actually gives you some idea of what I meant by when we operating income losses were actually, all these years we're operating at a loss, and starting in 2013, 14, and 15, we're now in the positive territory. And if you can see the trend, when we started implementing, we were going up an upward trend. The other one is the return on asset. All these years, now if you look at 2013, 14, and 15 is now reversed because of all the measures we took. And this last one is the debt service forecasting. And if you look at it, we were at 1.2.9 in service debt. Debt service, and now it backs down to about $1.4 million because of the way in which we were able to manage our debt effectively by buying out the high interest loan with Bank of Guam and secured with the ADB loan, and then the debt service deferment with RUS. And we use all of this to actually refurbish of our generators and reinvest back in our capital assets. And then now once these are no longer in effect now, especially the RUS, now we're back to 1.4. This is much more manageable when we are now having a better efficiency on our generators, and our costs are below our revenue now. So conclusion, all in all, reforming an organization that has been under the same management structure since its formation was a monumental task. A corporate culture in place that was the bedrock for almost 4 decades was one of the main reasons why reform was no easy task. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your sharing of the problem and how the RMI deal with this problem, and I saw it's working, I think. So for the next speaker, let's Mr. Sione from the Tonga.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. distinguished participant, invited guests, and my fellow speakers. I think the technicality of all this reform has been explained by Mr. Russell. But I'd like to share the experience from the Tongan perspective in terms of SOE reform. And my topic is the political commitment and governance as the two drivers for the public enterprises reform. And allow me to share the Tongan perspective. A brief outline of my presentation is I will talk about a brief history of the public enterprises in Tonga, the list of public enterprises. Then I'll focus more on the two drivers of the reform in Tonga, then the impacts and some of the outcomes or lessons learned that I might share with our other colleagues. In 2002, that's when the SOE reform has been introduced into our government. And being managed and monitored under the Ministry of Finance, with a time that I think the government at that time is not really have the or realize the importance of the public enterprises in our economy and the life of our people in Tonga. Most of our public enterprises has been provided some of the essential services, especially in utilities, communication, and other sectors, which is directly impact on the daily life of our people. For example, the power, water, and other services. Since 2002, and the introduction of the reform in 2007, government started to realize the importance of these public enterprises, and also looking at the frustration of the financial performance of these public enterprises, they introduced the reform in 2007, appointing a dedicated Minister of Public Enterprise, and also the establishment of a Ministry of Public Enterprise just to focus on monitoring and looking after of these public enterprises. Since 2002, up to now, there were a few public enterprises where schedule from our list of public enterprises. There are few were introduced and established. So up to date, it's about 14 public enterprises under the portfolio of the Minister of Public Enterprises. In 2010, government realized that there should be an amendment to the Principal Act of 2002 with the highlights to enhance the principal objective of why public enterprises has been established, to become successful in terms of profitable and deliver the best quality of services to the people. Up to date, these are the companies or public enterprises, or we understand the SOEs that under the portfolio of our ministers. And you can see most of them has been providing the essential services to the people of Tonga. And we've been, throughout the reform since 2007 up to date, there are a few challenges that's been faced with, there were about 4 ministers were appointed along the way to look after these public enterprises. And there were challenges and some successful stories. This graph shows the financial performance of these public enterprises since 2002 up to 2014. And you can see that in 2009, 10 and 11, there were a downfall on their financial performance due to the financial crisis and some major changes in the some of the big public enterprises. As I mentioned before, one of the key successful to our reforms throughout the years is the political commitment. With their good leadership, especially when ministers and cabinets, they came in with a positive attitude to try and support us with our reform. They've been supported us in the proposal and recommendation for some of the public enterprises that need to be privatized, rationalized, and even liquidate. As I mentioned in 2010, we realized that it's not really clear the primary objective of why these companies become a public enterprises. So they amended the Act to strengthen and enhance the objective of public enterprises to be successful in terms of profitable, and deliver the best services to the people of Tonga. Not only that, we introduced in our Act on that time the community service obligation, but we used the term of government policy obligation, GPO. We just provide an assistance from government to some of the public enterprises. They deliver services to the community which is not profitable. Also, in our Act, we clearly indicate the duties and responsibility of the directors. One of the highlights of the reform on the past few years, government decided that no more ministers or political representative to parliament in a board. It has to be business-oriented board, except in a case if a new company or a public enterprise established that can be allowed a few ministers, relative ministers, to be there, which shows the political support to make sure that that company will come to a stage to be run itself, then we recruit directors from outside. Also, the Act enhanced there is a must for all the public enterprises to have a summary of their annual report in the local newspaper. Board has to be accountable to the performance of the company. And not only that, lately, in 2013, we tried to have a specific required rate of return for each public enterprises. In them, we categorized the public enterprises to big public enterprises, medium, and small. We just indicate the rate of return. From the start, we just set 10% for all of them, and then we realized later after the reform that they are in different categories and business natures. The second one, as a key drivers to our reform, is governance. With the objective to improve corporate governance, encourage sharing of good practice, improve efficiency, and reduce duplicated costs. One of the examples that I may share that we introduced on the last year, in October, a model of shared director. Shared director in the idea that we are trying to move the public enterprises to become either merging public enterprises in the future or introduce the idea of holding companies. We completed the implementation of the first 3 groups. Out of the 14 companies, we categorized them into 5 groups, which is utilities, ICT, transport, agriculture, and property and financial management. With this idea, for example, utilities, is power, the water, and waste. They are different company. They still have their own individual board, but sharing the same personnel, which means there were 5 directors sitting on that board, the same 5 directors sitting on that board of water, and the same 5 directors sitting on the waste board. With the idea, the best interest, they will be running that business, whatever the best practice, their policies, they might implement it on the other 2 to upgrade the level of performance. And we can see on the past few months, the benefit has been reflected over what we've been expected from government, which is reflected in the operational level. They already shared, for example, the water, the waste authority and Tonga Power. They use the billing system of Tonga Power to do the billing for all the Tongan, which is very efficient in terms of correction revenue and giving out the billing to the customer. These are the kind of activities that we know that the directors of Tonga Power has act on their best interests to use that across the other 2 companies. And some other benefit has been reflected of been sharing the board of directors. These are the major impacts that we've been realized throughout the years when we implemented the reform in Tonga. The financial performance has been improved amongst these public enterprises. It's been increased opportunities for private sector to involve, strengthened the governance, a stronger working relationship between the shareholder, the board, and the management. Like Chris mentioned before, when ministers and some of the directors has been there before the reform introduced, the board thought that they are the owner of that company, and they run it for their best interest and whatever they think is. When the reform came in, they realized they have to report government is the shareholder, which is one of the key highlights on the reform so far. Not only that, we've been improved the public enterprises compliance to our act and the requirements in our policies. In 2013, we introduced a SOE ownership and divestment policy that established reform and/or privatization strategy for all PEs. Before, we just do ad hoc, depending on our assessment and monitoring of the performance of PE, then we decide what kind of reform we can introduce. But this framework has been introduced and help our ministry to identify, based on this framework and metric, of which are and what type of reform to be done to a particular public enterprises. And of course, throughout the years, there's a positive contribute to our GDP from these public enterprises. The outcomes and some of the things that I may share, public enterprises required to operate within a tight commercial mandate and to hold boards accountable for the result. We do also have a performance management system in place to assess board of directors' performance. So they have to be accountable for all the results. Sometimes a lag between reform and result because of some significant external factors and interference can impact. My advice, don't lose faith. Because all the way, if you have the political support and a good team, you can still achieve what you've been targeted for. Reform need to be closely or not be costly or complex. For example, like I said about the shared director or shared board approach. A robust and effective board leads to improved public enterprise performance. Sustained reform is only possible with sustained political commitment. Ministers and even cabinets have to plan, sell, explain, even defend public enterprise reform. Lastly, having a dedicated minister with a ministry to look after these portfolios is an asset. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sion, for your sharing on how political commitment and governance drive SOE reform in Tonga. So now, let's listen from the Kiribati.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Bula Vinaka to all distinguished participants. I am pressed for time, so I will have to skim through quite a few of these slides. My topic today is to share some of our experience undertaking SOE reform in Kiribati. I'm sure you will get a copy of this slide, so briefly, the agenda I have on this morning's presentation is to give you a brief background of the SOE reform program in Kiribati, describe some of the activities, and then focus on item number 5, the observations and lessons we learned while undergoing reform, especially for the SOE portfolio in Kiribati. And I'm sure we all share this same background that led to SOE reform in many of our countries. Basically, we had a lot of public financial management issues with a stagnant economy, recurring budget deficits, unsustainable drawdowns from our reserve, sovereign reserve fund, and uncoordinated borrowing, resulting in large non-concessional debt by not only the government but also by the state-owned enterprises. The SOE portfolio contributed a lot to the government's headache because all the performance and ineffective systems led to losses on the part of many SOEs, and of course at the end of the day they had to go back to the government to bail them out. And the main reasons for poor SOE performance, just a couple of there: ineffective governance and accountability systems. There was no systematic planning or business strategy. Ministers were intervening too much in the operations of the state-owned enterprises, and we had many cases where ministers were forcing directives on SOEs without any financial support and dismissing the SOE boards if they did not comply. We had quite a few SOEs which were competing with the private sector. This is mainly in the import of foodstuffs, hotels, and businesses like that. And of course, the story with these SOEs was they had poor profitability. They had their community service obligations were not recognized by the government, and yet the government continued to give them ad hoc subsidies. At the end of the day, this is roughly 2008, 2009, the SOE portfolio was asking $20 million in bailouts over 4 years, or a four-year period commencing from 2006 up to 2010. This included unserviced bank overdraft, direct grants for operational cash flow, and these sort of subsidies. So when the TA or the Technical Assistance Program funded by ADB was negotiated with the government in 2008, the main objective was to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the SOE portfolio, particularly in the governance and the accountability sides. This was supposed to result in outcomes like cost-effective services, improved profitability so that they can pay their corporate tax to the government, and hopefully in time also pay dividends. The program was also supposed to result in creating a level playing field so that the private sector can be attracted to increase investment and thereby increase employment. And on the government side, because they can now reduce their focus on state-owned enterprises, they can focus more on their core sector, which we think should be law and order, health and education. So with that main objective and expected outcomes, the first phase of the technical assistance from ADB commenced in 2009 and ended in 2013. Phase 2 commenced from 2014 and is supposed to end next year. Just running through a couple of the activities or the main activities, just to give you an idea or familiarize you with our reform program. Under phase 1, at the early stages, we set up a steering committee, an SOE reform steering committee, and also got the government to fund the seed fund of $500,000 to pay for the expenses of the reform program. This committee actually was very useful because it provided a sort of bridge between the technical assistance program and the government and on officials. And it also helped us to fast-track any issues or any actions that were held up. Along with that, and in support of this committee, we set up an SOE state-owned enterprises monitoring and advisory unit within the Ministry of Finance. And this unit was charged for overseeing the SOE portfolio in a lot of respects. It was like setting up a mother for the SOE portfolio. One of the early actions that the technical assistance program took was to stocktake the SOEs at that time in order to prepare a comprehensive reform plan. At that time, we had about 25 SOEs. At this time, we have roughly 16 SOEs. So between 2009 and today, we have got rid of 8 or 9 SOEs in the process. And in order to do that, we had to design an SOE retain or exit policy, a sort of divestment policy. Which SOEs are you going to keep and which SOEs are you going to exit from? And together with that, we had to manage the staff redundancy policy, which was a very sensitive social issue. Actually, a previous government in 1995 lost the elections because of this privatization program. And then, in addition to the exit policy, we also needed to prop up a lot of SOEs which were going into serious financial problems. And for that, we did a comprehensive business improvement plans for 4 of the most problematic SOEs. Of course, financial statements and audits are a common issue around the Pacific, and we had the same issue trying to update the financial statements of our SOEs. And then also during that period, 2009 to 2013, we conducted structural reforms for 4 SOEs, and 2 were closed without any reform because of insolvency. Phase 2 activities commencing from 2014, basically this was the consolidation phase. And the first activity, a very important one, was to set up the SOE Act, which was eventually passed by Parliament in 2013. And this provided the legal framework, the legal authority for a lot of the proposed SOE reform processes and procedures, especially for governance and accountability. Under that SOE Act, SOEs were required to submit a statement of intent annually, and this has now been accepted as the principal planning and accountability document for all SOEs in Kiribati. Based on the statement of intent, which is a plan for the next year, plus 2 other years, the SOE is required to submit half-year progress reports as well as annual progress report based on what was planned in the statement of intent. Also, in the consolidation phase, we tackled the issue of community service obligations. What the government needs to pay if it wants to interfere in the operations of the state-owned enterprise. And of course, we had to conduct workshops to get across the messages and train people in the new requirements of the SOE Act, especially for directors and senior managers. Some reform transactions were carried out in the second phase. First was the sale of the telecommunications company, state-owned enterprise, and the Captain Cook Hotel over on the other side on Christmas Island, which is still ongoing. The sale of Telecom was completed last year, May of last year, and the new company, private company from Fiji is now operating our telecoms. Also, undergoing structural reforms was the merger of 2 of our copra companies. One was the marketing company for copra, the other one was the milling company. And it didn't make sense that they were operating side by side, sometimes making decisions that were not rational. So the government decided to merge these copra SOEs, and this is expected to complete at the end of this year. Other improvement institutional reforms are still ongoing, basically with the shipping company, the plant and vehicle unit, which oversees government vehicles and special plant, and the Public Utilities Board, which is responsible for electricity, water, and sanitation. Now, the main observations and lessons learned. Firstly, we all know, or we should agree, that reform success requires the commitment by all the stakeholders. And the stakeholders in this case, the main ones will be the donor partners, cabinet, and the officials who implement cabinet decisions, and of course the TA program. How we attain this is still not 100% success, but we have a working situation or working model. Was we set up the steering committee, which is chaired by the Secretary to Cabinet, the Chief Secretary, and since she has direct contact with all the donors, with all the, she sits in cabinet meetings as the chief advisor to the government, and also she's in charge of all the secretaries of ministries. She actually became the bridge to all these stakeholders, and it has worked quite well for us. Any issues that were holding up the program, we only needed to refer it to the chair of the committee so that it can be fast-tracked. As I mentioned earlier, the committee was given $500,000 as working funds, and this was supplemented by the sale of SOEs. So the first one that was sold was for $1.8 million, so it went and supplemented this initial seed fund. The main approach is consultation and consensus in this steering committee. The second observation we'd like to make is that in order to manage your SOEs, you need an effective framework. And I think that was a message given by our previous speakers. And in our case, that was provided by the SOE Act, which was passed in 2013, supplemented by the SOE Monitoring and Advisory Unit. The third point we can make is that the issues we identified at the beginning of the program will involve or will change as the work progresses. As new data, new findings come up, they add new aspects and new dimensions to the initial issues. So that requires at least some flexibility on the part of donor partners in terms of the TOR, the terms of reference, the timing and the funding for the program. We needed the TA to be practical and flexible so that we can have solutions which were tailored to the situation. And for that, we needed competent personnel with best practice experience. Fourthly, social issues can delay or destabilize reform. I think that is a very common factor in Kiribati, where small populations, small countries, everybody knows each other. And things like land tenure are very complicated and needs to be solved as early as possible before you do your reform. The redundancies is very sensitive because the people concerned will be losing their income or livelihoods. And it tends, in most cases, it creates anti-reform sentiments. What we did in this case was to change the redundancy policy of the government, which was approved by the cabinet. And that is, we convinced government that the most affected people were the ones in the lower range, the lower range of the structure of the organization. And in most cases, these were also the ones with the high turnover, the staff at the bottom of the pyramid. What we asked the government was to give them a minimum salary redundancy package, which was equivalent to 6 months' pay at their level. This was approved, and it helped a lot to tone down the anti-reform sentiments that were circulating at the time.
1 minute.
Okay, the last point is that the aftermath to SOE reform can be very messy and needs to be cleaned up. Our approach to that is to try and, because most of the issues relate to staff claims and creditors, we try to resolve these claims well before they are due, or well before the actual transaction takes place. We feel it should be a standard part of any reform program. We also found that the sale of shares of the company is the simplest and cleanest method of reform. But in our case, that was not always available or desirable. And there were situations which required concessions or other forms of PPP, public-private partnerships. And we also retained the board, even if we reduced them to the minimum number of two members per board, together with an officer in charge and an accountant to handle claims. These are some of the remaining challenges we face. Getting the new government, which was elected in March this year, to accept the new concepts. High turnover of SOE monitoring and advisory unit staff. We need to work further on the community service obligations, and also to improve SOE profitability further. And at the bottom there, you see the remaining SOE structural reform transactions still to complete. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Ketu. So now let's have I think 5 to 10 minutes question and answer. If you have any, let's take 2 or 3 questions from the audience. Please raise your hand and mention your name, your institution. Everyone's clear? Or any question? One? Yes, please.
Good morning, or is it afternoon already? My name is Ben. I'm from Marshall Islands, but I work for ADB. I was involved in some of the early stage reforms, including helping that guy in the middle design the comprehensive recovery plan. One of the biggest challenges is to get politicians off boards. David's not going to like this because now he's a politician. But he ran the company for the last 5 years to help turn it around. How did Tonga and Kiribati manage to convince politicians that it's better off if they're not making commercial decisions? Because this seems to be the biggest sticking point in the Marshalls. So I wanted to hear how you guys manage that. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Any others? One more, I think, if you have. Otherwise, please, one more? Sorry, I cannot see.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Win. I'm from Papua New Guinea. My question is on benchmarking SOE performance in the small island Pacific economies. SOEs in PNG have 2 main problems. One is the first one is the return on asset and equity are low below. Simply or mostly zero profit so far. And second problem is there is high tendency of political influence in SOE operation in PNG. So far there has been some sort of competition, especially in the telecommunication sector, but the competition has an effect to it. It is at an high cost, whereby the small income earners could not afford the high cost of telecommunication. And my question is that, would you recommend or make some suggestion on how to overcome this. Thank you.
Thank you. Because of the time, so I think let's listen from each speakers, starting from you, Chris, or
Doing the experience of
okay,
getting rid of boards.
please.
Thank you very much. I'll just touch base on the first question with the experience and how we go about in removing ministers and parliamentary representative from board. Before I just say how we did it, it was simple, but the reason why we have that approach. We found out from the former board that when the ministers and political representative is in the board, especially the representative from the people, they try to push their self-interest, which is overrule the whole interest of the company. That's one thing. Another thing is when the minister is in there, even he's not the chairman or still a director, he or she dominated how the board operate. It is not healthy in the business environment. Except in the case, like I mentioned, that one example that we have a full board, which is the ministers, to establish the Tonga Cable Limited. Which is a very good approach. It's been appointed on a term of not more than 12 months. Because that time all these ministers has been keen and very supportive to establish this company. But these are the reasons. How we did it, we just introduced the amendment to the Act in 2010, clearly indicated there will be no minister or political representative in a board, except in a case of establishing a new company. That's the only simple way we did it. We just put it in the Act so that no one will go against the Act. Thank you.
Thank you. Kiribati, maybe.
Thank you. If I got the questions right, how did the political powers got into the reform? Sorry? How did we get him out? Okay, thank you. That has always been a touchy or sensitive topic in Kiribati. And for the record, the SOE Act that was passed in 2013 includes a provision that no MP can become a member of any board of an SOE. So that ruled them out completely from becoming board members. That was in 2013, but prior to that, there had been cases before, like Sione mentioned, where parliamentarians became part of a board and they influenced a lot of decisions for their own benefit. So ministers after that time did not select any MPs or members of parliament to any board after that. So we didn't have that much of a problem after the initial cases happened, and the ministers got very aware against that.
Thank you. How about RMI? You have to share something about this issue.
Well, I'm a little bit in conflict right now because I am a member of parliament, and as Ben mentioned, I used to be the CEO or the general manager for the combined utilities. And yeah, there's actually a state-owned SOE Reform Act that was passed in 2015, and which actually allows, there's a transition up between 1 and up to 3 members of parliament or public officials to serve on these boards. And I think there's a three-year transition, if I'm correct. And but I mean, I have a mixed feeling a bit because given the size of our population and the capacity that we have, you know, when you have, if you look at the case in point at MEC, you know, during the time that we were going through the reform, which will show the results shown in the presentation, is that most of the folks that were on the board were, some of them were predominantly members of they were either public officials or ministers but I think, you know, at the end of the day, it really boils down to people. And if you have, you know, structures in place and, you know, policies and, you know, rules of engagement that everybody will follow, I think it really doesn't matter. I mean, that's just my own personal perspective, but it really boils down to individual people or person in the board that actually will do the right thing. And I think there's always that, you know, negative connotation that, you know, if you have politicians or leaders in these boards, they're going to drive down the company. But I think it really boils down to people, and if there's rules, as I said, there's rules of engagement, and you know, set policies where you have to follow. I think that should be the focus rather than. But again, that's just my own personal opinion. But as I said, in the marshals, we have this SOE Act that, you know, will allow a transition, but it's up to 3 people. But I think after 3 years, all of us will be out of the board. So I still am a member of this Combined Utility Board of Directors. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris.
Thank you. I'll try and be brief. Just on the first point in relation to politicians being on boards, one of the key findings from the study is that good governance leads to good SOE performance, poor governance leads to poor performance. Having ministers sitting on SOE boards creates an irreconcilable conflict of interest, and we would not recommend it. We think ministers should come off. And that certainly is the experience throughout the Pacific. The only country in the Pacific now that has ministers on boards is the Marshall Islands. And I leave you to interpret whether or not that's one of the reasons why their portfolio is the worst performing in the Pacific. The point, I'm being really rude, aren't I? And just on the Senator's comments on the transition, you know, that was the concern when that Act was drafted, was, you know, exactly the concern you raised, that you need a transition period because you need to build the competency of directors in the country, and I totally understand that. But I understand that the Parliament's recently passed an amendment to the Act that's deleted that provision, and now ministers can stay forever. And so, certainly I would be, if I was in the Marshall Islands, I'd be advocating against that. Just on the question in relation to PNG, I mean, it's a very, very complex and detailed question, and bearing in mind I'm cutting into people's lunches, I can't give it the time that I should, but I would say that performance of the SOEs in PNG has deteriorated in the last 3 years, and it's got a lot to do with the fact that there is a very, very confused legislative and governance structure there, and for those SOEs that are involved in either monopoly or competitive activities, I think that the economic regulation needs to be enhanced quite significantly to deal with those. There's a lot of work that's going on to do that, and the ADB is very heavily involved in that, so I think you will see an improving trend there. But I think that the Kumul holding company structure that's recently been adopted is rather confused, and I don't think that that will encourage improved SOE performance in the short term.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really sorry because the time, and sorry also I take your lunch time for 10 minutes. If you have more questions, we have discussion in the lunch time maybe. So I will not conclude this.
Sorry, before that, I forgot to mention that we brought 50 copies of the Finding Balance study with us. There's the pre-publication draft, and that's thing out on the table. We've only got 50 copies. Thanks. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So let's give a big hand to our speakers. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello? Okay. Dinner. Lunch is served outside at the same place where you had your tea. Please come back at around 1 o'clock to the parallel session that you want to go to. Thank you very much.
Off ko tawali nito.
you.